Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Robert Doar, and as president of AEI, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this afternoon gathering with this wonderful assembly of public intellectuals. Robbie George, Ian Rowe, Marianne Glendon, Cornel West, Jacqueline Rivers, and of course, the Reverend Eugene Rivers. What a lineup. Today's event is one that I think speaks to our country's highest ideals, and it gets to the core of AEI's mission. We research public policy because we believe Americans can govern themselves, and that we need the most rigorous research when doing so. But our belief in self-government is founded on another belief, our faith in the inherent dignity of all people. Our universal human dignity comes from a source beyond any government or human power, a source that I, and I know many of you, believe is a divine, spiritual power. Our respect for democracy rests on our respect for one another, not as intellectuals or even as fellow citizens, but as individuals equally endowed in our Creator with certain inalienable rights. This is the spiritual core of the American experiment in self-governance. It's the moral basis for our democracy and the rule of law, and it's an integral to our mission here at AEI. Now, today's date should remind us of what happens when we ignore our country's highest ideals. And even now, we struggle to come together as a nation and to rally behind our founding principles. To overcome this challenge, we will need leadership and faith. And to provide an example of that faithful leadership, I'm very proud to welcome the Reverend Eugene Rivers, founder of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. In addition to his long-standing ministry, Reverend Rivers has for decades brought together divergent thinkers to discuss difficult issues and find common ground. Reverend Rivers will sit down with AEI Senior Fellow Ian Rowe to discuss their work, bringing people together in the public square. Afterwards, Dr. Jacqueline Rivers, Executive Director of the Seymour Institute, will moderate a distinguished panel of scholars. AEI's Dr. Robert P. George, Ambassador Marianne Glendon of Harvard Law School, and Dr. Cornel West of Union Theological Seminary. I look forward to this conversation on practical ways to strengthen our government's spiritual foundation, and most importantly, I hope it will exemplify the kind of civil discourse our country needs. So I'm very happy you're all here. Happy Friday, and I think this is going to be a terrific discussion. Take it away. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Reverend Rivers, first of all, it's a great honor to be here, and certainly an honor for us at AEI to be partnering with the Seymour Institute, and it might be helpful for you even just to give a 30-second overview.
Sure.
But a year ago, you organized a set of pastors to come together for a prayer vigil. And it was interesting, you did an interview, and you said, our backs are against the wall. We have to do something. Partisan politics will not get it done because they don't have the vision. In Ephesians 6, it says that without a vision, the people will perish. Why is that such an inspiration to you? Why is it so important at this moment that people come together in prayer and in other ways? And what is it about Ephesians 6 that's been so central to driving why we're all gathered here today?
First, I want to thank God for this event. I'm Church of God in Christ, so number one, I'm gonna thank God. Then, number two, you thank the Father of the house. So I want to thank Robert Doar for his extraordinary graciousness, because in some sense, given the current state of the country, this itself is a miracle. And I just want to recognize some folks and to provide some context and background. I've got Scott Hagan and Rich Wilkerson, who are board members, who are important because they joined us last year. And I'll try to do this quickly. We see the event. In fact, I'm in a restaurant in Dorchester called the Blarney Stone, and I'm reading. I got my cup of tea, and I get a phone call from my daughter. And Daddy, they're trying to take over the country. And so every parent has to have their social justice warrior. So the baby is the social justice type, right? So she calls Dad. I said, "What are you talking about?" "Yes, Sojourner, yeah, I know." And so one of her speeches, right? She says, "No, Dad, no, this is not just one of my speeches. It's like really crazy." So I'm in the restaurant, and I asked some of the folks, "Turn on television, man. My daughter's going off." And I turn on the television, and I don't know what you folk want to call it, but it was a hot mess. So I'm not going to debate and fight with none of y'all about what term you want to use. I said, I'll put it this way. If it were the brothers, a lot of people would be going to jail right now. But I'll leave it right there, right? So when I saw it in the restaurant, I began to pray. And as I watched it, I said, this is madness. This is absolute madness, right? So we prayed because I come out of the Pentecostal tradition. We believe in prayer. We believe that prayer can initiate and provoke supernatural phenomena, right? If God's infinite, I mean, that's part of the logic, right? If God's infinite, God can perform miracles, right? I mean, it follows, right? And so we began to pray, and I started thinking about, well, what should the communities of faith and the churches do? And what was striking, and this is the day after the event, as far as I could tell, right? No major church leaders that I recognized stood up and said, listen, 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, you got to turn from the wickedness, I'll heal the land. And that's a basic thing that most folk in the black church, right? We pray that stuff and believe it.
Yep.
But we didn't hear, as far as I could see, any major Christian leaders that stood forth to articulate this is not right.
And why do you think that is? Why is there that void?
My sense is, and I want to be very careful, right?
My
sense is that there's a spiritual crisis that the church is in the midst of. We're in the middle of a spiritual crisis. And I'm going to give you another interesting example on this. When Trayvon Martin was murdered, there was this Black Lives Matter movement that emerged. Now, my read, because I spend most of my time on the ground working with young people, is that the ascension of Black Lives Matter was a direct result of the failure of the black church. Had the black church been where they should have been, like, a good parish priest or a minister, and been ministering to the needs of these young men, there would have not been the vacuum into which this development, which ended up being much more complicated. And I'll just leave it there, right? And so I recognize that this country desperately needs courageous spiritual leadership that will stand in the gap and speak to the existential crisis that confronts us. One additional point on this, right? Professor West, my mentor, I met Professor West when he was 9 years old in Leverett House Dining Hall at Harvard. He was 9, right? And and in the course of our relationship, he authors a very important piece, which the left and the right misunderstood. He authors a piece entitled Nihilism in Black America. Nihilism in Black America. And the thing that is extraordinary about the piece is that he says, I'm going to reject, you're in a fancy language, the false binary, right? I'm going to reject the false binary of structure versus culture. They are indivisibly connected. So there's simplistic reductionism on either side. is inadequate. Then he says, and this is really mind blower, right? And here again, this made Professor West's intervention so important. And as I've told this to Professor West before, I said, look, the most important political essay of the period for Black America and Black intellectuals is this piece on nihilism in Black America. And then I said, and then the other part that makes it so dynamic and incredible to this day, he says, after delineating the dimensions of the nihilism, he said, and to begin to address this, we need some form, generally speaking. Now, when he runs in these circles, he'll say metanoia. He'll say metanoia, transmit, that's a big, high, lofty Greek, metanoia. Now, what we say to the average guy, there needs to be a conversion. There must be a conversion experience that people, that results in people's vision and understanding of reality being transformed. And so I'm reading that there and saying, oh, watch out. Oh, Cornel, I see you. He says there has to be this conversion, this transformation. And part of what's plaguing us now is that the faith communities have surrendered and turned their back on the moral commands of the gospel. The Bible says, righteousness exalts a nation and sin is a reproach to any people. Listen, God is expecting the community of faith to be salt and light. I mean, that's the command, right? Salt and light. And it's been our failure. The bourgeois Black churches have turned their back on the poor and created the leadership vacuums into which all this other mess exploded. See, it's really, I mean, in some sense, in the Black church, and Professor West has been challenging the churches around this stuff, and where we are now is that the faith communities must now engage in a dialogue with the intellectuals. You see, there's been, so that the dialogue, the insights, the observations that Professor West has been actually fairly unique in advancing have to be part of a larger dialogue involving conservatives, liberals, because he's articulated a vision which was just essentially just radically biblical.
Right. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what role intellectuals and the Black church should play for all of America. And 30 years ago, you wrote an open letter in response to Noam Chomsky's essay, but you entitled yours, "The Role of Intellectuals in the Age of Crack." And in that article, I mean, it's very powerful, please read it, but you quote a young Black mother from Dorchester who's talking about, well, all you intellectuals, and she said to you, "What difference will all their big words and fancy concepts make in my son's life?" I sit in a lot of rooms like this, and I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. Right. There is often a disconnect between those of us who devise all these great ideas. They're very far removed from the very lives of the people that we claim to be advocating for. Yeah. So what is the role of people in this room and all well-intended, good-minded folks who call themselves intellectuals and want to address these issues?
I'm glad you raised the question, and before answering that, I need to clarify some nonsense. The role of the intellectual is to engage in the critical interrogation of ideas. To pursue knowledge, to advance knowledge, to elevate the public discourse. The intellectual is not supposed to generate reams of gibberish, right? Just insufferably turgid nonsense, right? Masquerading as theory when it is just complete bunkum. It is the responsibility of intellectuals at one basic level, and Chomsky got this right. He may not have acted and done everything that he said, but the role of the intellectual, in part, is to tell the truth. To tell the truth, to communicate ideas, and in telling the truth, to be a voice of conscience for those who need to be defended. Now, the left are flaming hypocrites on this because they'll talk that talk, but when it comes to unborn children, black life don't matter. Some of y'all missed that. Let me do that again. Some of y'all didn't even catch that, right? So that was a quick move, right? I did a little fake for you, right? You see, it is the moral responsibility of the intellectual to engage in the critical evaluation of ideas, questions of value and ethics. That's their responsibility. And to defend the defenseless. I mean, listen, Professor West has been doing this, like I said, since he was 9 years old. There's a sophomore at Harvard, right? And he was willing to stand up against those who would challenge his right to have an idea. It wasn't as though they wanted to debate the idea and let's say interrogate the discourse, right? They rejected and denied his right to articulate positions which would not be fashionable. When he writes that nihilism piece, which is frankly, in the last 40 years, probably the most important thing written by a black intellectual on politics, because he went to the philosophic presuppositions that inform the discourse and said, there's got to be a different narrative, and we must bring more conceptual sophistication and reject this left-right structure versus values versus culture, this nonsense, which does not, and wrap this up on the answer to your question. So the responsibility of intellectuals is to use our privilege, access, and opportunities to advance the interests of those who cannot defend themselves. Now, I want to be real clear. You know, if you're in the university, you do your job, you do scholarship. It's not your job. You're not morally obligated to run into the hood, right? And, hang out and, that's not your job. What we need in the black community, because right now, the black community is in a deep philosophic and political existential crisis. What Professor West articulated in that initial essay, they didn't catch it. They did not catch it. And we now have this spiritual, philosophic, and cultural crisis, which creates, for you in particular, an extraordinary opportunity, because we have this, this gaping leadership vacuum.
Yep. So speaking of leadership and the need to stand up, particularly with moral voice, so we are being shot right now on C-SPAN,
Yeah.
which is wonderful.
Yeah.
But tonight, there's another network called the Stars Network that is premiering a new show that's so popular, it's been renewed for its second season.
Right.
It's called The Black Mafia Family.
That's right.
Everyone hear of this show?
Oh, yeah. I watched it a couple nights ago.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah.
You should
I
have shut
followed
it
this
off.
BM thing. I followed it.
So the Stars promotes it as an inspiring story of two brothers in Detroit.
Yeah, right.
Who
Exactly.
build this criminal empire.
Yeah.
Drug trafficking,
Yeah.
money
Yeah,
laundering,
right.
prostitution.
The whole
and this
thing.
is not the only show of its
No,
kind.
absolutely.
So there are far more people watching the Stars Network. Unfortunately, they're watching us on C-SPAN. So what is the role of our faith leaders in general, but in particular, to speak out against that?
Now, you raise an interesting question. I'm not going to pick on Professor West much more this afternoon, right? I'm not going to be on him hard. But the reality is, this is actually a very deep point. You see, I'm going to talk about conservative intellectuals, right? I slapped the left around, which is easy to do because they're not the sharpest knives in the drawer. So, so they do what they do, right? However, the conservatives have forfeited an opportunity for leadership because they refuse to engage the questions of culture. This is very, very powerful. I was thinking about this because, again, Professor West, he's an aficionado of R&B and blues and jazz and everything else. Now, my point is that we conservatives have to decide that we will be intellectual adults and honestly interrogate the culture as opposed to, assuming, incoherently that we're above this stuff. You see, Professor West and the hip hop thing. Look, we have to engage the culture as intellectuals. So that doesn't mean you co-sign Megan Thee Stallion. You ain't got a Cardi B. I mean, that's a bit much, all of that, right? But you don't co-sign it, but you must understand it and understand the institutional, spiritual, and cultural foundations of the disorder. You see, it's inadequate to call the disorder a name when you exhibit no comprehension of the deeper dynamics which inform the disorder. Quick on this black mafia family thing, right? See, the most brilliant characterization, in my view, in television was The Wire. Now, if you're Mr. Wire, you're a culturally partially literate individual. No. In fact, don't even nod like you. Don't even look at me like you didn't know, right? I want you to fake it and say, yeah, right. So I don't look disapprovingly at you because you're a cultural illiterate. The Wire was the most brilliant television in the history of television. And if you missed it, you were sleeping. David Simon, you gotta, if you it's a masterpiece, right? And on this crisis thing, I'm not gonna spoil it for you folk who were inexplicably disconnected from watching the most important television in the history of television, right? So I'll forgive you, right? And pray for you since I'm in that mode, right? I'm in a prayerful moment right now, right? I see some people's face turning red, right? So I won't look at you too close, right? So you see, we have to engage the culture. You see, there's no point disapproving of a person's behavior if you don't understand it. I mean, it's no point. In fact, let me tell you how crazy my thing is, right? I went to some of my friends at Harvard, right? After having seen The Wire and met a couple of the cast, I said, "Listen, man, you got to come to Harvard." So they were shocked, like, "Wow." I said, "No. Let me tell you something. Kima, Sonia San, Jamie Hector, Marlowe, the infamous Marlowe, the terrifying Marlowe, right? And we brought them to Cambridge. Gates, Bill Wilson, they had all the scholars studying the culture. The conservatives, right, couldn't spell it, but said, I'm illiterate culturally. But then again, jazz, R&B, right? You slept pretty much the 20th century in terms of artistic genius. So how exactly does a person lead like that?
Yeah.
Right? And so my point is, there must be, by conservatives, an intellectual engagement in the things you disapprove of. So at the very least, as an intellectual, you understand the thing and then undertake a diagnosis and give some kind of prescriptive vision that transcends your pathetic, illiterate disapproval.
All right, we are going to go to the.
See, y'all got me going. See,
No, it's
down,
good.
Right?
No, I got one more for you.
Y'all pray for me, Jackie. I don't want to get too worked up here, y'all.
We're going to go to the panel soon. But no, the real talk, because there are those that witness the consequences of what happens to people like Cornel West when we do speak out against the things that we disagree with.
That's right.
What's your counsel for those people who were voluntarily sitting by the sidelines, disgusted, but not having the courage to speak out?
Excuse me. My bishop just came in. So y'all forgive me, right? Bishop, we got to find you and the First Lady a seat. Now, you can't be standing up. I have to give you my chair. Come on, Bishop. Come on now. See, I don't want to get back to the presiding bishop, right? One of my bishops came in, right, and I didn't take care of him. Now, y'all gonna bear with me, right? See, I plan to live a long time, right?
Yes.
So I'm gonna make sure my bishop, and I'm introducing some black culture, right? And where's the First Lady?
She's all good.
Yes. First Lady, listen, now, I'll give you my seat, First Lady, if I could.
She's good. She's good.
We okay? All right. Thank you, Bishop. God bless you, Bishop Felton.
All right. Finding courage.
Yeah. You got to pray. You have to pray. On that note, I want to correct a sort of historical fiction. All of the work that we've done, in talking about the courage thing, all of the work that we've done in Boston and other cities, one of the most extraordinary developments, and I want to correct, Newsweek got it wrong. The reason that we were able to do the work that we have done working with gangs and violence is Dr. Jacqueline Rivers. No, this is, no, okay, yeah. But this needs to be said for the record. In 1990-something, our house was shot into. It's one of two times. There were 29 hot shells in the street. They were trying to shoot dude A, and none of these knuckleheads could shoot. So with two pistols, they shot. The first 3 bullets went in our 3-year-old son's bedroom. And on the courage thing. So after the shooting, Malcolm runs into our bedroom. I tell him it's firecrackers, so calm him down. We went downstairs. We had other members of our community, and we met in the street. The bullets were still hot from the 2 pistols. And the brothers, we grabbed hands, and we prayed against the spirit of violence and fear. Literally. We got there, the shells are still hot in the street. We prayed against the spirit to give us the power and the courage to withstand a demonic assault on what God wants to do here. All right? So we prayed. We prayed. This Holy Ghost prayer. This is gonna cast some demons out. We got it in it like that in the street that night. It's 2:30 in the morning. We get up. All the media show up, right, the next day, and all the kids in the neighborhood, because they had heard it, right, say, "Yo, man, the minister's leaving. The minister's going. He's moving," because we had been adopted by the kids in the neighborhood, right? So everybody, right, the minister. So a reporter comes to our house, and he says, I'm talking about courage now. He says, Reverend Rivers, what y'all gonna do, man? They got 29 bullets out here. We had a church van named Bertha, and they killed Bertha. They just shot Bertha up because these Negroes, right? So they shot up Bertha. The 3 bullets went in Malcolm's room, and and so I said, they said, well, y'all gonna leave? I said, well, it's my wife's call. I'm talking about courage. See, there's been a lot of press about me, right? But they missed the whole story completely. Because I wasn't the story. I'm from Philly, so I'm supposed to be around ignorant people like this. So there's no accomplishment in Rivers not backing down for a bunch of punks that couldn't shoot. That's what you did when you were a child in Philadelphia. Cornel knows, right? So there was no accomplishment for Rivers. Now, the miracle was the upper class, bourgeois, totally refined, Phi Beta Kappa Summa undergraduate, right, who risked her life and said, if God called us to this, that's the quote, if God has called us to this, he can keep us. Oh, no, I'm trying to tell you something, Doc. Let me tell you something. That I think it might have been a black reporter, I don't know, right? That reporter did not know what to do. And she sat there and she says, no, of God. And then she got worse. Brother Cornel, no, I'm just warming up, Doc. It got really terrible, right? He said, now, because if we were to leave because we could, what would we be saying about the children who can't? Was our child's life
Oh my gosh. Ephesians calls us, in addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith.
Come on, God.
With which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows
That's right.
of the evil one.
Amen.
Please join me in celebrating Reverend Rivers.
Good evening to everyone. I'm Jacqueline Rivers, and that is my husband. It is really an honor for us to be here this afternoon, to be here with the American Enterprise Institute. I want to join him in thanking Robert Doar, Rebecca Good, and Ian Rowe for their welcoming us into AEI. The Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies is so honored to be partnering with AEI on doing this event. And we are grateful for their vision in recognizing the importance of this moment. To have these three brilliant speakers, Marianne Glendon, our beloved Cornel West, beloved Robbie George, to have them talking about this very important topic. And you heard briefly, but that this really started for us in the Seymour Institute last year, when we convened a group of clergy to pray for the country on the anniversary of January 6, 2021, on the first anniversary, to pray for the country in the face of this astounding and dismaying event. And for us, this panel is really an answer to prayer. It's an answer to prayer, an opportunity to think more deeply about what happened then, about the roots, and about the consequences, about what we do going forward. This work between Seymour Institute and American Enterprise Institute is vitally important for us because it models the power of discourse and engagement across difference. We are encouraged that we can affirm our common values and our common commitments to reasoned debate, to respectful engagement, to the rule of law, to the common good. And we are excited at the thought of finding more common ground through this process of reasoned engagement, of finding more ways that we can work together. Ephesians 6 tells us to take up that shield of faith, but it also says that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, and the powers of this dark world. As Americans, we shouldn't be fighting with one another because we are citizens and co-residents of this great country. But there is a battle to be engaged. There's a battle around culture. There's a battle, as Ephesians 6 puts it, against spiritual forces that are at work in the society. And that's what we want to work on this afternoon. Because for us as followers of Christ, this battle starts with prayer. But for all people of goodwill, it should start with a celebration of the best of what is true about this great country. And also with a confrontation of the failings and shortcomings of the country. We need to wholeheartedly engage with our fellow Americans who disagree with us and have a different perspective. So we celebrate the historic overturning of Roe v. Wade and of Supreme Court decisions which have been almost unanimous in protecting religious freedom, such as the recent decision in Fulton v. City of Philadelphia. But we must also confront the enduring racial tensions that persist so many decades, even centuries after the end of slavery. We have to recognize that African Americans faced a real disadvantage from the event that gave the biggest boost to the American middle class, the New Deal, as Ira Katznelson has so powerfully documented. We have to confront the enduring and continuing obstacles that poor Black kids face educationally because of intractable residential segregation, as documented by the work of Thomas Shapiro. We cannot just look at the aspects of America that we want to love and celebrate and not look at the shortcomings and the places where we need to do hard work. This afternoon, we're going to talk about the challenges to democracy. Even as right now in the House of Representatives, a new challenge plays out, as a Republican majority is unable to elect a speaker. At least last time I checked, they hadn't yet worked it out. I think they've recessed till 10 tonight. Or as it played out in the Senate last year, when the Democrats, or the last 2 years, when the Democrats were stymied by their infighting and unable to realize their stated agenda. But today we have an opportunity to reflect together on how the events of January 6, 2021 were prompted by the deep polarization of this nation, in which racially tinged motivations play a not insignificant part. It is an opportunity to think together about how the fundamental tenets of democracy protect the rights of minority groups, about how American democracy might be threatened now, and more hopefully, about how we can strengthen it. With that, I'd like to introduce three speakers who really need no introduction, and they've given me leave to keep this brief so that we can maximize the time that we spend hearing from them. Mary Ann Glendon is a learned hand professor of law emerita at Harvard University. She chaired the U.S. State Department Commission on Unalienable Rights in 2019 and 2020, and served as a member of the Commission on International Religious Freedom, and she has represented the Holy See in a wide variety of locations. Her work has contributed significantly to the legal and social thought in numerous widely translated works, one of my favorites being A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But most of all, what I love about Mary Ann is her brilliance and her extreme graciousness in all situations. So welcome, Mary Ann. Thank you. Robert P. George, is a McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He has chaired the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the President's Council on Bioethics. He was a judicial fellow at the U.S. Supreme Court, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. He's Phi Beta graduate of Swarthmore, holds JD, MTS degrees from Harvard University, several from Oxford, and received the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal and Princeton University's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. And one of my favorite things about Rob is the compassion with which he deals with people with whom he has very deep, profound disagreements. And I've seen it in action on more than one occasion. And then our beloved brother, Cornel West, who is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at Union Theological Seminary. He also held the endowed chair, class of 1943 Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and is former professor of the practice of public philosophy in the Divinity School and the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He graduated magna cum laude in Near Eastern Studies from Harvard in 3 years, obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton. He's the author of hundreds of books, chapters, essays, and in 2021, he won a Grammy Award along with Arturo O'Farrell for the year's best Latin jazz album. Amen. He has a deep commitment to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and recently was invited to give the famed Gifford Lectures in Scotland, known as the Nobel Prize of Philosophical Lectures. Brother Cornel's love for jazz is legendary and is only exceeded by his passion for justice. And with that, Marianne, I'd like to give you the first question. Marianne, of the current threats to democracy that we are facing today, playing out even now at the House of Representatives, which do you think are most in need of attention?
Thank you, Jackie. I just have to say how grateful I am to be here and to be part of the long-standing conversation. At last, a dream come true. The conversation between Cornel West and Robbie George. I'm going to start with the proposition that our democratic experiment is just that, an experiment, and that it's an experiment that requires certain conditions. In fact, Madison told us more than any other form of government. And those conditions, as we have been saying, of course, reside in culture. So I'm going to say that one of the most important threats to our democratic experiment is one that doesn't get mentioned in the debates following January 6th, and it is the erosion of the cultural and moral conditions that a democratic nation needs in order to survive and thrive. And that erosion, add to that the current state of our culture-forming institutions, the institutions where the young people who, before you know it, are going to be leading the nation, the institutions where they learn, or where they acquire, the knowledge, habits, attitudes that will enable them to carry out the challenges ahead. And so those circumstances cause one to wonder, or should cause one to wonder, whether we are approaching some kind of tipping point. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but one of the oldest puzzles in political theory is, in fact, whether you can even have a republic in a territory with a large and heterogeneous population. The American founders defied the classical learning on the subject, and they decisively answered that question yes, based on their faith in their ingenious design for government. But they knew, and many of them said explicitly, that that design required certain qualities of character and competence in the citizenry and in the statespersons. So that's why Benjamin Franklin, when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention and the woman asked him, "What have we got, Mr. Franklin?" He said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." Well, that was when the population of the United States was 4 million inhabitants. Now we have 333 million, deeply divided on many crisscrossing cultural and moral and political issues, increasingly losing confidence in our government institutions, our governmental actors, increasingly mistrusting the sources of information on which they have traditionally relied. So it's food for thought and somewhat disappointing that the debates on the threats to democracy have not looked into the cultural conditions and the state of the foundations on which democracy rests. And if I may paraphrase Pogo, it's as though they're afraid to do so because they may think they will meet the enemy and it will be us.
So, Robbie, that really speaks to a question I want to put to you, which is, as a constitutional scholar, could you explain to us why the American founders warned against democracy and opted instead to found a new nation as what they termed a republic? Today, we treat these two as synonyms. Is there a difference? If there is, does the difference matter today, especially given the erosion of the culture that actually supports democracy?
Well, thank you, Jackie, and let me join with my fellow panelists in thanking Robert Doar and the American Enterprise Institute for hosting our forum today, and thanking Pastor Eugene Rivers and Dr. Jacqueline Rivers and the Seymour Institute for organizing this event. I want to say to Bishop, after working with Gene for all these years, I think he deserves a raise. And of course, what a blessing it is to be with my beloved honorary godmother, Mary Ann Glendon, who's been such an inspiration to me for my entire time as an academic, and my beloved brother, Cornel West, from whom I've learned so much, and who has just been such an inspiring example of disciplined, determined truth-seeking and courageous truth-speaking. And at the end of the day, the preservation of democracy is going to come down to those two things. That is, determined truth-seeking and courageous truth-speaking. You can't do without them. You can't run a democracy, a republic, without them. But now to get to Jackie's very interesting question about our founders, about the American experiment in ordered liberty and republican government. Why did our founders draw this distinction between a democracy and a republic? We today tend to think of those as synonyms, as Dr. Rivers said. They didn't. They drew a distinction between the two, and they made very clear that they were not supporters of democracy. Democracy was a pejorative term. That's not what they wanted to establish. Why not? Democracy, demos, the people, krasi, rule. Don't we want a regime in which the people rule? What's the alternative? To have a strong man, a tyrant, or perhaps a benevolent dictator? Do we want that? No, we certainly don't want that. So then don't we want democracy? Well, the founders were realists about human nature. They had their flaws, no question about that. They were also very brilliant, and they were students of history. And when they looked back over history, what did they see when they saw democracy? They saw, for example, who murdered Socrates. They saw democracies fail over history. And when they failed, what replaced them? Not something better, something even worse. When they failed, they collapsed into the worst forms of tyranny. So the challenge was, how can we create a regime in which the people do rule, but where we have some protection against the dangers of democracy, the flaws of democracy? And here the idea was to avoid what we would today call direct or unmediated democracy and put in its place what they would call a republic. That is a regime in which there are democratic elements, to be sure, very crucial democratic elements. The people have a voice, but where there are checks on power at every point. So we have a national government that is not a government of general jurisdiction, exercising plenary authority over all aspects of life. No, quite the contrary. We have a national government that is a government of delegated and enumerated and therefore limited powers, leaving the general jurisdiction with the states. It's the states, after all, that under our constitutional system exercise police powers, plenary powers, the powers to protect public health, safety, and morals, and to advance the common good. And even within the national government, we have structural constraints on power. We sometimes call those the separation of powers. Instead of concentrating power, we have a separate legislative branch in which all, check me on this, look at the very first word of the very first sentence of the very first article of the Constitution. That word is all legislative authority herein granted is vested in a Congress consisting of a Senate and a House of Representatives. It didn't say some, it didn't even say most. It said all. Query. Why has our government missed that? Why do we have our courts exercising so much legislative power? Why do we have our executive branch exercising so much legislative power? When all legislative power under the terms of the Constitution, Article 1, Sentence 1, are vested in the Congress. That's a side issue. The wisdom of the founders was to separate power. We have a legislative branch, but a separate executive branch. We don't have a prime minister. We don't have a parliamentary system. And then very importantly, we have an independent, separate judiciary. Why the need for these checks? In order to avoid the dangers of unmediated or direct democracy. We don't want to be the kind of regime where a murder of Socrates can happen. So we opt for a republic. And what makes us a republic as distinct from a democracy in the view of the framers is that we do have these constitutional structural constraints on power. But as Marianne said, and it went by quickly, I don't want anybody to miss it, Madison himself, the architect of the Constitution, noted that these structural constraints on power to prevent Republican government from degenerating into tyranny, they are merely auxiliary precautions. Auxiliary precautions. That's not my term, that's Madison's term. That's the founders. Auxiliary precautions. Well, if they are auxiliary, then what's primary? What do we rely on even more than the structural constraints on power to prevent the collapse of democracy into tyranny or Republican government into tyranny? The founders are very clear on this. There's no substituting for it. Civic virtue. Virtue in the people. A people who understand their Constitution and are willing to live by it. And here we have a real problem, because across the political spectrum, across the ideological spectrum, conservatives and liberals and everybody else seem not to want to live by the constraints on constitutional power. They don't want to exercise that civic virtue when it gets in the way of getting what they want. It gets in the way of the outcomes that they want. Living under procedural rules, structures of democratic deliberation, is hard and it requires discipline. Sometimes you are going to lose. And when you lose, you have to accept your defeat. You have to let the system work, remembering that we're a democracy in the modern sense, a republic, as the founders put it, which means that no losses and no victories are permanent. Because we live in a government or a regime in which the people rule, we can always come back. We can always reorganize. We can say, you know what? 4 years ago, we made a mistake. We went down the wrong path. We need to rethink this. I want to persuade you, my fellow citizens, that we should reverse course, undo what we did, go back to it. But how do you get virtue in the people? And I'll conclude with this. If we need virtue, if that's even more important than the structural constraints, as important as those are to preserve a republic and prevent it from collapsing into a tyranny, how do you get that civic virtue? You don't get it from the government. They can't mandate it. You don't get it from the economy. You don't get it from the business corporation. The market doesn't produce it. I've got a more sanguine view about markets than my brother Cornel does. But I don't think that the market produces civic virtue. How about the legal system? Can the judges command the people to be virtuous? No, it doesn't work that way. Here's where Marianne's point about culture is so critical. If we're going to have virtue in the people, a well-educated people, in the rich sense of education, morally educated, not just information, not just what Cornel calls cheap schooling, but genuine deep knowledge, moral formation. It's going to come from the institutions of civil society, the non-governmental institutions, beginning with the family, the religious community, the church and other religious communities, the civic association, the voluntary associations, that must, no matter what the role of the government is, we can debate the role of government. There are important debates that have to happen there. But however those debates come out, it's going to be the case that the primary responsibility for providing health, education, and welfare will rest with the institutions of civil society, with the government, for reasons that Aristotle made clear centuries, millennia ago. And that is, the government doesn't know your name, doesn't know your kid's name. The government doesn't know that Jackie and Jean's kids are Malcolm and Sojourner. But mom and dad know. Grandpa and grandma know. Pastor knows. Teacher knows. Coach knows. And those are the people who can form, in that deep sense of education that includes moral formation, that can form young people with the virtues they need to be responsible participants in this grand experiment in ordered liberty, in Republican government, which is why we have to be so centrally concerned with the health of the institution of civil societies. This goes all the way back to Tocqueville. He noticed the way American democracy really does depend on flourishing institutions of civil society. The market can't do it. Often the market will harm if it's unleashed. Market forces will give you stuff that will undermine your children's formation. We can see that. Well, Gene was talking a little bit about that. So can't rely on the market to do that work. The market can do many wonderful things. I'm pro-market, but it can't do that. And it's got to be checked when it's undermining that. Same with the government. Government does a lot of harm, even when it comes to moral formation. It certainly can't substitute for the family, or the church, or coach, or pastor, or grandma and grandpa. And same with the legal system. All of those systems depend on there being a large number of citizens who have civic virtue. We're not going to preserve this experiment without civic virtue. They rely on it, but they can't produce it. Business corporations rely on employees who will show up at work on time, not drunk, not on drugs, do their work, do a good job, not embezzle, provide honest work for honest pay, but they can't produce those things. Legal system depends on jurors who will be honest, not corrupt, actually live by the law. They can't order that there be such people. Political system can't do it. If it's going to be done, it's going to be by civil society. So we've got to pay far more attention than we have paid to the health and well-being of our civil society. That's the lesson that I take about the moral foundations of democracy.
Thank you. Cornel, so Gene talked about your piece in Nihilism in Black America.
Yeah.
And you're rejecting the false binary of culture versus structure. But culture, we've seen, is so important in this discussion of democracy. What do you see as the interaction of culture and structure here? What role does an institution like the church play in the kind of moral formation that Robbie has been talking about? And to what extent does the growing distrust of institutions in the country, for example, the feeling that perhaps among some on the left that the Supreme Court is compromised politically, and the feeling that those checks and balances that have been put in place have been undermined in the recent past. How do those things play in the challenges we're facing now in democracy?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for allowing me to be here and to take in all of this wisdom and inspiration. I want to salute my dear sister, Professor Rivers, my former colleague. She's a Harvard professor, Harvard College, Harvard PhD, and married to my dear brother, Reverend Rivers. I'm telling you, what a do-all. My dear sister, Mary Ann Glendon, who has been exemplary in so many ways, even as we critically examine each other and have our disagreements. I have a great respect for her, and even as she continues to wrestle with what's going on now in Rome with the legacy of the Pope and so forth. You've done it with such grace and such dignity, so it's a blessing to be here with you. And anytime I'm sitting here with Brother Robbie, I know I'm going to have a good time. We've been at it for 15 years. I met Brother Rivers 51 years ago, and I'll still take a bullet for him. Maybe not in the heart, but in the shoulder. You know, the heart's for Mama and Anahita, but my wife, but in the shoulder, yes. Yes, indeed, because I love this brother. He's the real thing in terms of saying what he means and means what he says. Malcolm X used to say, sincerity is my only credentials. And that's very important. He doesn't pose in posture like so many of the arrogant neoliberals or so many of the arrogant neoconservatives, or even some of the more raw neo-fascists acting as if they're one thing and doing something else. No, he is candid and honest. So even when I disagree with him, I still take the bullet. I fight for his right to be right. I fight for his right to be wrong. And we're going down together. Why? Because it's an answer to the question. I want to begin with the Rivers household. I want to begin with the West household. Irene and Clifton and Shiloh Baptist Church and House of the Lord, Pentecostal Church and Bishop Felton and others. We are talking about the best of a black people who looked at the American Republic and democracy and heard all of the wonderful words and was still terrorized and traumatized and hated chronically for 200 and some years. And it's not a function of skin pigmentation. We got black thugs and gangsters. I got a lot of thugs and thuggishness and gangster in me. But we're talking about the best of a people that say, de Tocqueville is right. The civic virtue is not something to talk about. It has to be enacted and embodied on the ground. So in the face of all of this hatred, here come the love warriors like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells Barnett and Martin King. Why are you loving? Because we tied to something greater than us. In the face of all of the terror and the lynchings, we choose not to be a black version of the Ku Klux Klan, because if black people had chosen to be a black version of the Ku Klux Klan, there would have been a January 6th every 3 or 4 years, because every black community would be a site of terrorist cell. But no, here comes the black church. Here comes those falling in love with a Palestinian Jew named Jesus of Nazareth. Here comes the black people that says, in the face of all of this terror, we choose freedom for everybody. In the face of all of this trauma, we choose not to be wounded hurters, but wounded healers. Here comes Louis Armstrong. Here comes Curtis Mayfield. Here comes Nina Simone. Here comes Duke Ellington. Here comes Mary Lou Williams. Here comes Aretha Franklin. All of that terror, all of that trauma, all of that hatred. How you keep dishing out that love and joy? How you keep dishing out that healing? Maybe you at your best could be the leaven in the American democratic loaf that, given all of its talk about democracy and republic and equality on the ground, we're going to enact civic virtue in ways in which a French aristocrat named de Tocqueville never conceived of. But we use his great insight as a starting point. And what happens then when the civic virtue, in which exemplified just in my own tradition, the black tradition, Jewish brothers and sisters did it with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and a host of others. The Italian brothers and sisters did it with Vico Marcantonio and a host of others. The Irish did it with a whole host of grand freedom fighters too. It's the human thing, but it's rooted in one's local practice, because the younger generation is thoroughly convinced that they don't see exemplars of honesty and integrity. They don't see examples of statesmanship. All they see is market manipulation. All they see is narcissistic, opportunistic careerists, not just politicians. This is true for the professional managerial class across the board. That's part of the neo-fascist backlash in Brother Trump, because he's an honest gangster, consistent across the board. Say anything, do anything, no accountability, no answerability, no responsibility. I do it because I want to do it. And the projection is what? Not just him, but it reinforces the worst of a culture that says without trust, without integrity, without honesty, all the laws in the world, all the talk about separations in the world of tinkling, of sounding brass and tinkling cymbal, they're empty. And that's precisely what the Black Freedom Movement said to America. All your promises are empty if you keep hating us and terrorizing us and traumatizing us, but we can help make your ideals real by trying to enact civic virtues, because all we have to fall back on for so long are our families and our churches and our mosques. We've always had Muslims in our community, and I'm a Christian and I love my Malcolm X's and others. And our temples, I love bell hooks, Buddhists, and yes, agnostics like James Baldwin, who comes out of the church but the church never leaves him in terms of the love that's manifest in his attempt to break from the church because the church fails, but that same love and compassion he learned in that church at its best and in those narratives about that Palestinian Jew named Jesus are still operating. And I want to be very honest. I mean, as a Christian, I do not believe that we have a monopoly on all the good stuff. I just believe we got a lot of the good stuff. I just want to be honest about that. But this is personal testimony. It's not the most sophisticated cognitive engagement. It's just a matter of which choices one makes in terms of how one lives one's life. Those deep existential questions, you see. And so right now, we're living in a moment of overwhelming spiritual decay. That's just clear. There's a callousness toward the weak. Now, we disagree about abortion, but it's clear that unborn babies, if you believe they are human beings, there's an indifference toward the weak in that sense. There's a difference toward the weak and those in the hood. There's a difference toward the weak and those in barrios. There's a difference toward the weak and those in ghettos. There's a difference toward the weak and the working class. It's all about the celebration of the success of the professional managers. And somewhere I read, he or she will be greatest among you will be your servant, not successful in the world, in but of the world.
Preach.
Nonconformist, over against the ways of the world. Every society has organized hatred, has manipulated fear, has routinized contempt of the indifferent. That's why democracies are so rare in human history, and they tend not to last that long. It's Plato's Critique in the Republic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those of us who have a claim to sustain and preserve democratic practices must always have that the Platonic critique in our skeleton. Democracies tend not to last that long because the people cannot survive with the levels of narcissism, hedonism, individualism as opposed to rich individuality. And we're at that moment in American history. America's been there before. The 1860s. What happened? Statesperson. Here come this non-credentialized, no-degreed figure named Abe Lincoln, with the Bible in one pocket and Shakespeare in the other. Not just any Shakespeare, it's King Lear and Othello. We're not talking about some of the other plays. That's all he had. But he had a spiritual formation and an ethical cultivation, just like the best of black folk. Wasn't a function of skin pigmentation. It's the choices that he made, the kind of life he wanted to live. And yet at the same time, the Republic experiment seemed to be over. Thank God for the 200,000 black brothers who joined the Union Army to help break the back of the Confederate Army to give America a chance. 1960, we're about to go under again. Here comes Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Martin King, Rabbi Heschel, Dorothy Day. Here comes a new wave. The Richard Newhouses was part of that. I know he's my conservative brother. Ooh, he was on the cutting edge. And of course, Sister Glendon was right there too.
Yeah.
In the 1960s, isn't that true?
That is true.
Absolutely.
Leon Cass.
Leon Cass, there's a whole lot of vanilla brothers and sisters got in on it. Very much so, but it was chocolate-led, not because chocolate is inherently good, but because chocolate people chose to be good, chose to be forces for good. Here we are again, 2020. Congress. It's not just dysfunctionality when you listen to the corporate media. No. This is a very sad moment in which it's clear that we don't have a level of virtues in our political class. The leadership is beneath mediocrity. And it's tied to big money and status and blitz and so forth. Where are the new voices, leaders, statespersons in mosques, churches, synagogues, universities? And so we know how corrupt the universities can be. Oh my God.
You had to bring that up.
Oh, we had to bring that, but it's very important because we don't want the politicians to think that we're just targeting them just because their mess is more visible. But they need to know they are still being targeted. Wall Street, where's the virtue? Big tech, where's the virtue? Churches, any color, including black churches, Where's the virtuous, sacrificial leadership that's focused on that blood at the cross, not the Kool-Aid you can dip into and gain access to the next blessing, i.e. commodity? No, we talking about religion, the religion that never grows old. That's what we're talking about. And it's not because it's the past, but it's because, as the great Gilbert Keith Chesterton put it, the tradition is a democracy of the dead. And we learn from the best of the dead so that we, the quick, can build on what they exemplified. And some of them exemplified the best, some of them exemplified the worst. This is not nostalgia. This is a selection that we make in relation to the past. And so the only way we actually deal with civic virtue is sense of history, sense of engagement, and last but not least, the enabling virtue of them all, which is courage. And one of the distinctive features of the professional managerial classes these days, conformity and cowardliness. For money, status, position. Do anything, say anything for money, status, position. I'm not talking about anybody in this room. I'm talking about a whole host of my precious fellow citizens. Why? Because it's in me too. And I have to try to kill it every day. Fight it every day. Brother Mark Jefferson know what I'm talking about, distinguished dean, assistant dean of the University of Virginia Law School. Kill it every day. And the only way you do it is with each other. That's why we're here together.
All right, Marianne, what do you think? Do you agree with Cornel that this is a moment like we faced in 1860s, like we faced in the 1950s? Is this a moment when democracy is really under threat? And if it is, and if culture is so central to it, what do we do? How do we strengthen the pillars of democracy?
Well, I think Cornel has altogether too rosy a picture of the situation. I think this maybe is my role in your conversation because I'm from, on the one hand, an Irish Jansenist Catholic tradition and the other Calvinist congregational tradition, and that gives me a special ability to see the dark cloud behind every silver lining. And I think that we all agree that everything depends on the culture-forming institutions of civil society, but I don't think we have said enough about the really poor shape that they are in. And before you can even talk about what we could do, I think you really have to understand how bad the problem is. So, Robbie, you mentioned child-raising families. I just read the latest Pew Research Forum report, which surprised even me. The United States leads the world in the proportion of children that are being raised in single-parent homes, and leads by a considerable margin. And then you look at the schools, and of course those of us in universities are very familiar with the pathologies that dominate in our universities, but the seeds of those pathologies are being sown right now in many of our primary and secondary schools. I mean, just the magnitude of the problem. And here's another appalling statistic that in international comparisons of basic reading, math, problem-solving skills, the United States is at the bottom of the developed countries. And you can't blame everything on teachers and schools because we are now, the job of teachers are now being asked to do many things that parents once did. You have this kind of downward spiral. And you mentioned religious institutions. The decline in religious affiliation, of course, we don't have to elaborate on the effects that that has on the cultural supports of democracy or our democratic experiment, but it also seems to be, because I think people have a certain spiritual hunger that will go somewhere. If it doesn't go into spiritual channels, you find a great deal of something that the Old Testament had a lot to say about, other objects of worship that people pursue with a kind of religious fervor. So.
And alternative forms of spirituality, which are growing in popularity.
Now, I would really like to go on with lots of more information about how terrible things are.
Getting dark and darker by the minute here.
But Jackie asked me to offer a few thoughts. And, I think the beginning of wisdom here is really to admit that we do not know very much about how to reinvigorate troubled social institutions. That's the beginning right there. And I think that suggests a couple of things, that maybe starting with the principle of do no harm. Even think about something like social environmental impact studies before you implement broad social legislation that, alas, in too many instances in our history, has turned out to be exactly counterproductive. Or you might have, and this is a really shocking proposition, but you might think that liberal, democratic, egalitarian societies might need to protect and nurture within themselves many organizations, institutions, groups that are not organized on liberal, democratic, egalitarian principles, child raising families, early education, many religious groups. So those are a few thoughts about the gravity of our situation and modesty and attacking the urgent task of trying to do something about the cultural foundations on which the whole democratic experiment rests.
So, Robbie, what do you think about what can be done by universities and colleges in terms of shoring up the very culture that is necessary for the survival of democratic culture in the U.S.?
Well, I do think that educational institutions at every level, as Marianne points out, K-12 through higher education, has a role to play, and I'll say a word about that in just a second. But set up what I want to say about that, I want to return to a point Cornel made about the centrality of the virtue of courage, which Cornel calls the enabling virtue. It's the virtue that enables the other virtues. When Cornel was receiving his doctoral degree from Harvard, when he was graduating, he was within the walls of Harvard Yard. I was still a student. I wouldn't be graduated until the next year, but I was outside. But we both heard Alexander Solzhenitsyn give his great address. I don't know if you were in the yard that day, Marianne. Now, you go back and look at that speech. Not everything in that speech turned out to be true. For example, Solzhenitsyn had a great deal more optimism about what would happen or could happen in Russia if it were liberated from communist tyranny than turned out to be warranted. He had a greater sense that the Russian people had preserved their fundamental moral heritage and that it hadn't been eroded by communism than we would see as creditable today. But I think he was absolutely right to put the focus on the virtue of courage, which he did, when he looked at the situation in the West. He said, when I look at the West and all the problems in the West, the decline of the culture, putting his finger exactly on the collapse of institutions of civil society, which he saw all the way back in 1978. Daniel Patrick Moynihan saw it way before, others saw it before. He said, what the West lacks most is courage. Why? Because that really is the enabling virtue. Now, the good news on that I want to deliver, I want to be the optimist up here, Marianne, is that courage is contagious. You want to know how to make people more courageous? If we need this virtue, which we do, exemplify it. All you need are a few people, some prominent in public affairs, more often just people influencing the people around them to model courage. And people find it inspiring and will follow that example. So people need to step up. We need role models. We need examples of people who exemplify that courage. It is contagious. The bad news is that so is cowardice. It's contagious too. When people, especially young people, see cowardice, they will emulate that as well. They'll hide and cower in the corner as well. But we do need it. But I want to talk about two other virtues that I think are critical to the preservation and the reinvigoration of our democracy. Look at the fundamental problem. People do not regard each other as fellow citizens. People across the ideological and partisan divides regard themselves now as enemies. They see their opponent not as someone with whom they disagree and are going to have a democratic contest over a policy issue. They see their opponents not only as adversaries, but as enemies, to be defeated, even destroyed. Bad people. Got to be done away with. They're evil. Those evil leftists, those evil right-wingers. Now, you're not going to get anywhere in a republic, a democracy as we would say today. It's not going to work if people treat their disagreements as making them into enemies to be destroyed. People are going to have to see themselves as fellow citizens who disagree. The virtue that is necessary for that to happen is the virtue of humility. Humility, especially intellectual humility. Where do you get that? It's the simple recognition, not simply notionally, anybody can recognize it notionally, but actually existentially, the real recognition of one's own fallibility. Anybody here infallible? Yeah, got a hand up when Pope Francis, welcome. No, nobody's infallible. We all know that we're wrong about some things. We're fallible, frail, fallen human beings. We're wrong about some things. And if I heighten the question, if I say, well, okay, so you're fallible, you can be wrong about things. You are wrong. Right now, you hold some incorrect views in your head, right? Everybody would say, yeah. Nobody thinks everything they believe right at the moment is true. They've had an experience changing their minds, learning new things to know that, at any given point, you're going to hold some things that are wrong. If I heighten the question by saying, is there anybody here who's infallible on the big, important things? So you can't be wrong about them. You can only be wrong about the small, trivial, superficial things. Again, people are going to say, no, I could be wrong on the important things, matters of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny. We all recognize that notionally. We need to recognize that deeply, existentially. And when we recognize that, then we can open ourselves to true civility, not cheap pseudo-civility, politesse, being nice to each other, listening politely while the other person speaks, but genuinely engaging another person with a desire to learn from and not just to preach to that person. That's really what we need. We need civic friendship like that. The great Judge Learned Hand, for whom Mary Ann's chair at Harvard was named, probably the most important jurist never to sit on the Supreme Court, Learned Hand, once said that the spirit of liberty is a spirit that's not too sure that it's right. Now, he wasn't embracing moral relativism. That wasn't Learned Hand. What he was emphasizing there is the importance for democracy, for Republican government, for ordered liberty, of recognizing fallibility, recognizing that we can be wrong, not being so fast to run over other people and their views and their opinions because we're infallible and they're bad people. We need that humility. The spirit of democracy, the spirit of truth-seeking, is a spirit that recognizes fallibility and is willing to learn from other people. And then the other virtue I want to put the focus on is one I would also hearken back to Solzhenitsyn about. 5 years after giving that Harvard address, Solzhenitsyn accepted the Templeton Prize in Religion. And in his speech, I believe it was in London, if I remember correctly, accepting the prize, Solzhenitsyn changed his analysis a little bit, shifting the focus from courage, which had been the focus of the Harvard address, to faith. Echoing Abraham Lincoln in his Thanksgiving Proclamation of 1863, the great Russian writer and dissident, echoing Lincoln, said that our problems stem from the fact that we have forgotten God. We have forgotten God. Now, how do you get a lot of problems from forgetting God? Well, as Solzhenitsyn recognized, if you forget God, then you forget that man, the human person, the human being, each and every one, no matter how poor, how vulnerable, how weak, is made in the very image and likeness of God, and therefore is the bearer of a profound, inherent, and equal dignity. You can run a republic if fellow citizens, despite their disagreements, all recognize each other as being made in the image and likeness of God, as being bearers of dignity, deserving that respect, even if we profoundly disagree, no matter how wrong we think they are. But if there's no God, if we've forgotten God, if we put him in the closet, if we pay lip service, but don't actually honor God, then we're not going to treat our fellow human beings as being made in the image and likeness of God. They're going to be enemies to be defeated and destroyed. They cannot be fellow citizens of a republic.
So Cornel, I want to give you the last question, even though we're running late.
I hope we
Robbie-
have time to open it up for
We
voices.
will.
Yeah, because we have to have call and response in the
Yes,
tradition.
yes, we do, call and respond.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
Robbie touched on two of the things that I wanted to ask you
Yes,
about.
yes.
One was this idea of talking to each other across difference. To what extent does the polarization that exists undermine democracy? And how do we get past it? And what role does faith and the church? You talked about the failures of the church when you spoke, even though Marianne said that you were very too optimistic. But what can we do about the role that the church, people of faith, might play in addressing the erosion of the culture?
Yeah, I want to draw a distinction between optimism and hope, because I have nothing to do with optimism. I'm a prisoner of hope. I have a very bleak conception of the wretchedness of the human condition. I just believe we have some potential.
Yes.
I just want to be clear about that. Now, once we zero in on what our potential is, you see, very Pascalian in this way, right? That the history of America, in part, is one in which there's been waves of awakening. There's been waves of moral and spiritual renaissance that seize people's hearts, minds, and souls, that unsettle them in such a way that they decide to go another way, be converted, and decide, I'm joining Martin. My mama's racist, but I think Martin King is right. So it's going to make Thanksgiving difficult at the family dinner, but you got to cut against the grain. You decide to go another way. Same would be true in regard to patriarchy. Same with regard to any form of ideology that loses sight of the humanity of people. Because we know, Brother Robbie, that there's been a whole lot of God talk in the last 250 years, and yet a lot of those God talk treating people in vicious ways, right? Jews, Arabs, Muslims, black folk, women, and so forth. So I got a lot of fellow Christians that I've got to be highly suspicious, even though I'm loving my crooked neighbor with my crooked heart. Because the God talk still gets in the way of how they actually act on the ground. But we need transcendence, and that's what we agree. We have to make a wager on transcendence in that regard. But in addition, I want to end on this. It's no accident that my dear, dear brother Robbie, and I have a love for this brother. He's not just my friend, even when we disagree, just like Brother Rivers, you see, that he's my brother. And it means then that the role of the arts become crucial. When you invoke Solzhenitsyn, what is it about that Russian novelistic tradition that makes it the greatest in the modern world with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Leskov? Why is Chekhov the greatest democratic artist that stays in contact with the dignity of ordinary people, but there's never been a democratic project in modern Russia? But we run to Chekhov, as Tennessee Williams ran to Chekhov, as the great Stephen Sondheim ran to Chekhov with his breakthroughs in musical theater, to deal with the underside, the night side, as it were. Well, in the history of America, let us be honest, the history of black music has probably played a more fundamental role in trying to get people to stay in contact with the humanity of other people across race than any other force. It's been much more effective on the ground than almost any other institution, including our churches. What is it about the arts? What does Percy Shelley mean? Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. He's not naive. He's not silly. He don't think they run things. He thinks they use their imagination and empathy in such a way that they authorize a better world of compassion than the one of hatred and greed. And we can do it in the poetry. We can do it in the music. We can do it in the arts. We can do it in the paintings. And our young people these days, unchurched, unsynagogued, untempled, highly suspicious of any form of religious authority, where do they find their transcendence? It's in the music. What has happened to the music? Marketized, commodified, dumbed down, but you can still feel the rich yearning and the hunger for something greater and grander. There's no civil rights movement without Mahalia Jackson, no SNCC without Curtis Mayfield, no SNCC without Nina Simone, and we haven't even got to Aretha yet. Meaning what? The arts are not decorative and ornamental when it comes to the shaping of civic virtue. They're a constitutive of who we are. They are integral to who we are. And it's so sad that our universities and our curriculums marginalize the arts as if it's something you do as an afterthought, rather than something you engage and find yourself Socratically challenged and prophetically pushed. And without the artistic witness, the vanilla blues brothers like Bruce Springsteen, and the Jewish brother from Minnesota, Bob Dylan, Brother Zimmerman, exactly, and the others. Cross-cultural fertilization, but concerned with what? Moral, spiritual, artistic greatness. We're going to the best. We got to go to Delta, Mississippi. We got to go to Robert Johnson. We got to go to Ma Rainey. Not because they're just entertainers. We find the wrestling with humanity in their songs and in their melodies and in those dissonants in such a way that it can change our lives. And we become better citizens. Democracy benefits, but it benefits because they're wrestling with what it means to be human, just like the great Russian novelists or the great Irish playwrights or the black musicians or the Persian poets, Nimai and Rumi, Farouk. What grand contributions to the world, helping us to shape ourselves to become more civically virtuous, more humanly compassionate. And yet in the end, I'm going to end with my dear blues Irish brother, Samuel Beckett. Try again, fail better. That's the history of our lives. That's the history of democracies. Try again, fail better. Failure is always a constitutive part of any human project. In the end, the question is, how good is your failure? And American democracies always had failures, imperial failures in Philippines and Vietnam and so forth, but it's also had some wonderful breakthroughs. And the question becomes, how do we accent the betterment and the ameliorative impulse of the fact that as wretched creatures and creatures with potential, we might be able to sustain the planet and sustain democratic projects as difficult and as dark as Sister Mary Ann reminds us. We find ourselves at the present, but never allowing despair to have the last word. There's a falseness and futility about despair, even though despair ought to be a constant companion for each and every one of our days in our lives. That's in part what the cross is about, and what that long Saturday is about, and what that surprise by joy of Easter Sunday for Christians like Brother Eugene and myself and a few others try to acknowledge.
Okay, I see I have a question here already. Let me just say a few words. We're over time, so please keep your question short. Please resist the temptation to make a statement, and we will just have one person on the panel respond. I think that there are runners with mics. Right here, please. And I see you next.
My name's Joe Freeman. I'll start off by telling you this is a question about pluralism versus polarization, but I have to give a little background to it. Not much.
One sentence.
I spent 1965-66 working for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the South. I observed what should be communities were in fact tribes. And the churches reinforced that. They didn't counter it. The polarization I saw in the South in the 60s has become more and more infested in the rest of the country, though not necessarily by race. There are plenty of other things. What kind of structures can we create to turn that kind of polarization into pluralism, where people talk to each other rather than, as Dr. King said at 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the country?
You want to take that, Brother Cornel?
Was that directed toward just all of us, or me, my dear sister,
But we only,
or
have,
what?
we only have time for one person to speak. We want to get to other questions.
Is it all right for me to just say a quick word about it? Well, one, I want to salute the work that you engaged in then and now. And I think when Rabbi Heschel said that the future of America depends on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and the others to fight that kind of polarization and gangsterization. It's not just polarization, it's gangsterization, it's outright gangster behavior. That pluralism that you talk about, that jazz-like sense of being flexible and fluid and listening to other voices and not just being an echo expression of a silo. It's the legacy of Martin King and others that we're talking about. And we have to take that legacy very, very seriously, not in the spirit of imitation, but building on it and trying to take it to higher levels.
If I can very quickly just go back to a point I made earlier about the importance of examples and role models. We need to see people modeling the willingness to engage with each other across the various forms of difference and to genuinely try to learn from each other. People need to be seeing that. They need to be experiencing that. And one great way to do it is when your team or your tribe or your party or your group does something you can't go along with, and this happens in every tribe, every party, every group. There are going to be times when they go down the wrong road. And any person of integrity within the movement will see they're going down the wrong road. They're not being true even to their own principles. People need to see that there's somebody in the tribe, in the party, in the group who says, nope, I'm not going along with that. I'm drawing the line here. We need to see that and we see so little of it. We all want to be team players, right? We want to be part of the group, part of the tribe. Don't want to be criticized for being off the reservation when it comes to this issue or that. But that's the best example that we need, examples of people who are willing to say, no, I'm not going there.
We have a question. Robert Doar.
First of all, I'm Robert Doar, I'm the president of AEI. I want to thank you all so much for being here and being part of this great discussion. I want to thank all of the audience that's here. This has been a lovely, lovely discussion. But I did want to follow up on Professor West's comments about the arts. And I wanted to ask him, and maybe just quick answer from the others, do you think that the mood of censorship and fear to say the wrong thing or to say the politically incorrect thing is infecting the arts in a way that we should push back on? That artists and musicians and theater people are no longer willing or able to express themselves with the freedom they used to have. And I wonder whether you think that's part of what's gone wrong in America too.
Appreciate that question, though, brother. Again, we want to acknowledge you running this institution, allowing us to be here and be part of this conversation, though. But keep in mind, I mean, the Russians had to deal with levels of censorship we know not of. Tolstoy worked it out. So did Leskov. So did Turgenev. Now, I don't believe that censorship was a precondition for creative breakthrough. No, not at all. But I think that the artists just have to be courageous. We got to fight any form of censorship. I'm almost an absolute libertarian when it comes to that in terms of lifting every voice. You see, I think people who are thoroughly wrong have a right to be wrong, and you engage them as long as they don't engage in injurious harm and so forth and so on. So in that sense, the free expression of religion and speech is crucial. Polytheists, I'm going to defend their right to polytheism in the name of Jesus. Now, that's going to take a lecture to work out, but it's allowing for voices to be heard, because I don't believe in coercion. I don't believe in repression. Because what's going on right now in Iran, repression, what's going on in so many places, repression, Uganda, and so forth. Artists have to deal with those situations, but they do. They do. One of the problems in the United States is that the artists are dealing with such a commodified culture that they think they can say anything and they have very little weight and gravity, and therefore they don't sustain the highest levels of artistic greatness when they say it. They want to be rewarded for mediocrity. No, that's a mediocre story. Sorry. Well, no, I'm the next Chekhov. Get off the crack pipe. Brother Mark Jefferson knows he's a superb writer himself with a short story, right? Dealing with the highest levels of greatness, the Ellisons and the Morrisons and others, right? And Dante's and Shakespeare. We have to be honest about that. But we have to fight censorship, but we also have to put a stress on the courage of the artists to raise their voices and pay a cost. Anybody who raises their voice, if Martin and Malcolm got to pay a cost, Curtis Mayfield got to pay a cost, Nina got to pay a cost, how come hip-hop artists got to pay a cost too? J. Cole, pay a cost, brother, you're sounding good. Cut across the grain. That's the history of being a love warrior and a freedom fighter and a wounded healer. There is no breakthrough without a cross. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is right, but we won't get into his theology right now.
President Doar, if I can add to what Cornel has just said, yes, no question, there is a serious problem of censorship in the arts, but everywhere else, certainly in universities. People are punished for expressing their point of view if their point of view doesn't line up with the orthodoxy. But let me tell you, there's a problem even worse than censorship in our institutions, including our institutions of higher learning. That's the problem of self-censorship. And very often, Cornel just pointed this out, very often, it's not just that they fear punishment. They censor themselves because they want rewards. They want to get ahead, and they're afraid that if they actually speak their minds, say what they think is true, if they are courageous truth speakers, that will impede their career prospects, their career progress. Yeah. We all understand that we're human. We all want to be successful. We all want to be approved. We all want to be applauded. So I understand that, but it's toxic. The self-censorship problem is even worse than the censorship problem. You can't blame that on the institutions themselves. We are each responsible for not censoring ourselves, for speaking the truth as God gives us to see the truth, and being willing to bear the consequences, as Cornel says, echoing Bonhoeffer, to pay the costs of actually speaking out. And that's a message people don't want to hear. Young people don't want to hear that. Parents of college students don't want to hear Cornel or me telling their children that. You know, they very often the parent wants to say, well, look, you know, if you've got a professor who disagrees with you, you just go ahead and write that exam or that paper as if you agree with him. You say things you don't believe. You put them down on paper. Do it with your left hand if you're right-handed, right hand if you're left-handed, with your fingers crossed. But you need to do that so that your career is not impeded. That's toxic. That undermines virtue. It undermines character. And it impedes our ability to reform these institutions. So I think we need to be hard-nosed and hardcore about self-censorship. Nobody is given a permission slip. We shouldn't give our students, we shouldn't give our friends, we should not give ourselves a permission slip to censor ourselves.
If I could just say one more word about the importance of protecting freedom in the arts, and that is, I think, implicit in everything that has been said here, is that any project for social transformation has got to begin with, coming back to Ephesians 6, a deep and meaningful personal transformation, one by one, from the inside out, so that some of us call conversion. And it's a very mysterious thing. What melts a heart, changes a mind.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm thinking of Pope Benedict, who recently went to rest. He said that what was more influential than all the treatises of philosophy in bringing people to the message of Jesus Christ were two things: its saints and the beauty of its arts. It's something mysterious that happens. If you've ever had an experience, you know, the metaphor of your heart melting, that doesn't usually come through learned treatises.
That's right. That's
As much as we might hope. So terribly important, Robert, and along with others, thank you so much for making this evening possible. Terribly important to protect freedom in the arts.
So I've been given permission to allow one more question. Over here. Sorry.
Thank you. Dr. West, I appreciate the sort of historical timeline that you laid out. So this is my question. The most, I guess, popular civil rights movement, racial justice movement in the last 50 years, Black Lives Matter, when they stated that they had a commitment to dismantling the nuclear family, given everything that we've talked about in terms of the importance of that institution, and none of the most politically engaged Black churches, journalists, institutions raised a word of protest. What do you make of that silence? And what do you see for the Black community, let's say in 30 years, if even the members of the aristocracy cannot speak to the importance of family? And when they show up to Black communities, they push abortion and the redefinition of gender with more force and passion than they do marriage and nuclear family.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, my dear brother, very much so. Because I don't exist without Irene and Clifton and Cynthia and Cheryl, which is the family on the chocolate side of Sacramento. So I speak out of personal experience. When I say I don't exist, I mean I don't breathe. That I don't have a sense of movement in the world without the precious memories of my family, which is inseparable from Shiloh Baptist Church and Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, my vacation Bible school teacher. So it's constitutive of who I am. When I listen to my young brothers and sisters talking about their engaging their critiques of families, what I hear first and foremost is those families that impose various mechanisms in that family that downplay the potential in that context. So by a patriarchal family, if the girls were not treated the way the boys were, you see, or if the gay brothers and lesbian sisters were treated as if they're less than human. Now we can disagree on same-sex marriage, and we struggle over that with my conservative dear brothers, and we disagree. But it's still got to be a love thing. Mm-hmm. You still got to love the gay brothers and lesbian sisters. You just disagree with the choices that they make. And once the family loses its enacted forms of genuine caring, nurturing, loving, and compassion, and any family can do that. Any family can. We don't have to read Freud for that, even though it's a good place to start, to see how dysfunctional families can become. So we don't want to romanticize families, but we have to defend the love in families in their various forms. And that is what I think very important, and that's what we may begin to have significant overlap on, because we can't talk about any kind of love warriorship, of love train and justice train, if you don't have sites or those particular platoons, as the great Edmund Burke would put it, the platoons that allow for the formation of souls, that allows for the love to take place. And family is a fundamental site, and it will be a fundamental site. But if it's patriarchal or forms in which there's not enough love in those families, certain kinds of critiques have to be brought to bear. So that in that regard, it's not a dismantling of the nuclear family across the board. It's trying to make families more loving to all of the various members of that family, whoever they are. As you know, I wrote a book, or co-wrote a book, called The War Against Parents. That was a long time ago, Neolithic age. But 1998 with Sylvia Ann Hewlett. Yeah. And what was the argument? Parenting is the ultimate non-market activity in a market-driven culture. It's not a matter of market calculation to have a family. If you're not ready for love and joy and a little bit of sweetness and hurt, don't have a family. Which is to say, don't fall in love, and so you never really live. You never fall in love, but that's another issue. So the issue becomes, how do we conceive of families in such a way that we're not content with present forms of family that are doing damage to various folk in those families. We want each and every member of that family to be viewed, treated as a child of God, as made in the image and likeness of God in that way. But does that make sense? Is that getting at? I don't want to evade your question, though, brother, even though I know it's going to take a long time for us to wrestle with it. No, it'll go on too long.
Yeah, I think you guys have to follow up on that.
Yeah, but we can follow up on it. We can follow up on it.
Jackie, can I just say a quick word about it? So I've been a rather fierce defender of the institution of the family through my entire career. I've learned so much on this issue from Mary Ann. But my very wise late friend, our very wise late friend, the great Midge Decter, once called me up short when I was a young scholar, fiercely defending the institution of the family, which she defended as well. There's no greater defender of the family than Midge Decter. But she said, Robbie, defend the family. It's crucial, absolutely important. He said, but don't romanticize it. I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, do you know what friends are? I said, you mean, do I know who my friends? She said, no, do you know what friends are? I said, well, what do you mean? She said, friends are God's compensation for giving you a family. Families aren't easy. They've got lots of problems. There's lots of pathology. You can't romanticize the family, but we cannot do without it. We need to strengthen it.
Right.
We need to uphold it, but we can't romanticize it.
That's right.
So I want to thank you all, not only for coming, but for staying so long. And I want to ask you to join me in thanking our excellent panelists.